Hello again. I was talking the other day about the way that the BBC tries to depict Britain as being chiefly inhabited by ethnic minorities. Another strand of this enterprise, which is carried out not only by the BBC but also other television channels both in Britain and the United States, is to try and persuade us that Britain has always been a multicultural and diverse nation, regardless of which era you glance at. Henry VIII was married to a black woman. There was a black queen in Regency England. These fantasies crop up all over the place these days, especially on the small screen. The latest example of this is truly delightful. It is a new series called The Irregulars, and it may be seen on Netflix. The Irregulars are the so-called Baker Street Irregulars who feature in a couple of the Sherlock Holmes novels by Arthur Conan Doyle. They first appear in Study in Scarlet. Now, I know that the Sherlock Holmes stories are fiction, and I suppose that one might argue that it makes no odds if we imagine the characters to be black or white. But there is actually a serious objection to the practice of inserting black, Indian and Chinese people into roles in historical dramas of this sort, and I'll come to it in a minute. As you can see from the thumbnail to this video, about 60% of Victorian London was made up of black and Chinese people, at least according to this version of the era which we see. I will overlook Sherlock Holmes' assistants, Dr. Watson, being played by a black guy, and also the fact that the Baker Street Irregulars in the books are of course all boys, rather than being an equal mix of boys and girls as they're shown to be in this new series. It certainly creates a weird impression seeing one of the Baker Street Irregulars being played by a Chinese girl, but perhaps I'm just old-fashioned and set in my ways. I'm also tremendously fond of and familiar with the Sherlock Holmes stories. I've got the complete works here, obviously, as you'd expect from a strange fellow like me. So what's wrong with this sort of thing, which is very common today? I can see two objections. The first is that youngsters watching programmes like this will honestly not know how absurd it is, and they will go off with the idea that Victorian Britain was really a cosmopolitan place then, as it is now. Perhaps that doesn't matter. I don't like to see people being misled about the past, but maybe it's not important. A more serious difficulty is that the presence of black and Chinese people is just accepted by all the other citizens of the time as shown in these television programmes as though it were quite unremarkable. In reality, there was a huge amount of racial prejudice against black people, Chinese and anybody else in 19th century Britain who was the slightest bit out of the ordinary, or foreign or dark-skinned. By showing black people being treated quite normally, with all the people they meet being apparently colourblind, dramas like this are concealing the awful way that minorities actually were treated at that time. The use of racial slurs was common, and the idea of renting a room to a black person, let alone accepting the idea of mixed marriages, would for most people have been unthinkable. Don't take my word for it though. Let's look at a Sherlock Holmes story which actually features a black person and see how Arthur Conan Doyle wrote about black people. I'm looking here at the adventure of the Three Gables in the casebook of Sherlock Holmes. What is described here as a huge Negro had burst into the room of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, and Holmes says, "Aha, da 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 da." The Negro says, and that's Negro in inverted commas, obviously, "Got that, Master Holmes?" "Keep on talking," said Holmes, "it's fine." "Oh, it's fine, is it?" growled the savage. You see, that's a completely gratuitous way of describing a black person. And here again we've got Holmes says, "Aren't you Steve Dixie the Bruiser?" To which the black guy replies, That's my name, Master Holmes, and you'll get put through it for sure if you give me any lip. It is certainly the last thing you need, said Holmes, staring at our visitor's hideous mouth. That's the sort of gratuitously unpleasant comments that were made at that time by people writing, mentioning black people. You can imagine how they would react to black people in real life if they came across them. Those comments are absolutely mild compared to other references to black people in 19th century writing. Failing to include in films and television plays the hostility that most people of that time displayed to foreigners and visible minorities is yet another way of altering the past and making it look more like the present. I don't think many young people today can have any idea of the dreadful way that black people were talked of and treated at that time, and I think it might be no bad thing to show them the reality of this. Instead, as I say, nobody bats an eyelid at the idea of a black man and white woman marrying or living together or anything else. Racism has thus been airbrushed from history. I can see why this is being done. For one thing, everybody making a television series in Britain today is thinking of how it will be received when it's shown in the United States. And for that reason, it's wise to include as many minorities as you can cram into it. This is a purely commercial decision, of course. Those making a series in America would also want to include as many black actors and other workers in the film company as they can manage, because the percentages of minorities are closely monitored, and in some places it will harm your business if you can't prove that you're an equal opportunities employer. A lot of film companies now are trying to operate racial balancing in their staff. The problem is that between what is appearing in advertisements and on the programmes themselves, it's all but impossible to recognise either the present or the past of countries like Britain and Canada. I mentioned Canada because I watched a few episodes of the new production of Anne of Green Gables a couple of years ago called Anne with an E, and found that that too was full of black people and old white lesbians, which was definitely not the case with the book. I think this business with television programmes is another of those situations that we're just going to have to learn to accept.